7. Boy, it's unbelievable. We're essentially almost 3/4 of the way through the course. Time sure flies sometimes. Anyhow, this week is actually a rather light week from the standpoint of lecture content. The topic really is communication. Now, for your term paper, the way that you're communicating the research that you've done is through a written report format. And that is certainly one way of communicating research that is done. In business, oftentimes, though, you will take that research paper that you have created and you will be asked to present a synopsis, an abbreviated, condensed version of that to senior management. And that's usually done in the form of a face-to-face presentation using a tool such as PowerPoint. So I did want to touch on a few general communication skills and best practices for this week. So one of the things why this is so important and why I wanted to insert it in here is that the ultimate goal of you going to school, I presume, is that you have a career path that you are interested in and you need to get hired for the job. So here's an article that was the top 10 skills they identified that will help you get a job when you graduate. And notice what number 2, 4, and 5 are. Number 2, communication. Well, that's what we're going to talk about in this lecture video. But I like there too, number 4 and 5, negotiation and persuasion. Now, persuasion is also a form of communication where you are persuading someone in the validity of your argument. You're persuading someone you're the right candidate to hire. And of course, problem solving is a big deal. That's really an awful lot of what this course is about, is how do you solve problems. And of course, before you can solve a problem, you have to correctly identify what the actual problem is that you need to be addressing. So anyhow, communication objectives. You can have a very general, broad overall goal. And the way to think of that is something like you want to increase the number of people hired. You can be a little more specific where you have specific, measurable, time-sensitive steps that are involved. And that would be like you want to hire 15 workers by June 15th. And then lastly, the outcome. What is that actual result that you're trying to achieve with the communications that you've been presenting to various people? For example, 10 people will sign up from this presentation. So this specific presentation that I'm making, there will be a result, a measurable result and outcome. It really helps you as you're preparing to do a presentation to keep in mind what that, general overall, action and outcomes are that you're trying to accomplish with all this hard work, time, and effort you're putting into the presentation. So one of the things to look at too is what type of presenter are you? And this has to do a lot with personality types. Do you tell someone what it is they need to do? Do you sell them on the idea? Are you a consultant? What is your style? Depending on where you are, from all the way from the left side, that's where you're in control of the content. And the more you move towards the right, there's more audience participation and involvement. I like to try and be somewhere in the middle there. And so when I'm doing presentations, I want to engage the audience as much as possible. And that's not by asking rhetorical questions of the audience, but actually asking the audience for some input, some feedback as you go along to keep them engaged. But it's all really for nothing if you don't have any credibility. And that's one of the reasons why I've been a little meticulous on spelling and grammar, although I will tell you that I have not been marking you down for misuse of commas, semicolons, colons, and stuff like that, but you really should be paying attention to that as well. But when you have an obvious spelling or grammar error, it immediately detracts from the professionalism and the credibility that you are trying to leverage in order, with this presentation. And, so make double darn sure your resume does not have any errors in it. Have it checked by other people many times. Make sure everything is perfect. So one way you get credibility is, based on your title. If you have a PhD at the end of your name, that carries with it a certain amount of credibility. So it's based on your rank, your title, and certainly in the business world, you get the vice president of operations. It tends to carry a little more credibility than the line supervisor. Whether that's correct or not, whether that person really deserves that credibility is another matter altogether. But in general, you do, just because of your position, you can receive a certain amount of credibility. Goodwill, this is where you have a relationship or a track record with a person or a group of people. And so you've done, great things for someone in the past. And so you want to leverage that past record, that relationship. And so when you're talking or presenting, you work that into it. You remind people of that excellent relationship you've had in the past. Expertise, that's your knowledge. And this is where you need to share with the audience if they don't know you. Even if they do know you, that you need to remind them that, you were, in the top 2% nationwide when you applied for grad school, that you received a scholarship based on your mathematical skills. Whatever those specific things are that lend credibility, that says you're an expert in this area. And so you have to be comfortable at reminding people about that without it sounding like you're bragging or you're conceited. Not an easy task. The other is the image. And this is where, a lot of celebrities are able to gain credibility. Why on earth would anyone think that someone who is a great actor would be an expert on science? And so if they spouted views on, scientific topics, that people listen to them, it's from that idea that saying, boy, I would really like to be by that person. And so if you are in a situation like that, you emphasize those attributes that people envy in you. If you're 7 foot, tall, and you're in a group of people that would love to be basketball players, you can work in those things. Like, one of the challenges, with my height is always having to duck going through doors. And you should see me trying getting into a little sports car. But you point out to and you remind people that characteristic that they admire. And then the last one is common ground. And this is where you have some shared beliefs, experiences, values, the needs that you share that in common. You want to, again, remind people, acknowledge that, we're all in this together. As we're going forward in this next business cycle, what's going to happen to your company is going to happen to my company. We need to work together. So you build that credibility in people's eyes that because you share these common values, ideas, needs, that what you say is going to be in their best interest too. They trust you because you're in the same boat that they are. Something to be very aware of is your audience. Who are you going to be talking to when you do this? You need to know them very well. Who are they? How much do they know? What are their expectations? Are they expecting you to give them a detailed presentation or just a really high level? Do they have some feelings that they've already expressed about a particular situation? What might change their minds? What could be persuasive? If you could show an ROI on a project of, only 4 months, would that persuade them? And this last one really applies to doing business internationally. Make sure you are aware of any cultural norms that may be involved. Depending on where you're traveling around the world, you can inadvertently offend your audience. One of the things I've showed some of my communication students, I was a video produced by the State Department, actually some very useful information. There are certain countries that if you sit on a desk, it's considered very rude. Now, personally, when I'm making a presentation, if it's in a room where there's desks, like a classroom, I like to just kind of informally, as I'm walking around talking, to sit down on one of the desks as we're chatting. I can't do that in some areas of the world. I would lose credibility. So you just need to be aware of any of those cultural norms. There are cultural norms around pointing. So you have to learn how to use hand gestures where you aren't pointing with a finger. And then some other questions about, is the audience you're coming into, are they a friendly audience? Are they going to be receptive, eager to hear what you have to say? Are they neutral? Who knows how they're going to react to it? Do they not even care? And no, that's not a picture of some of my students. My students look much more interested than that. But, is this, they're going, oh, great, another meeting I got to go to that I'm not, I really don't care about. And of course, the last one is, or are they hostile? You are walking in and they are just, they've got scowls on their faces. They are ready to tear your presentation to shreds. Know what you're walking into. Now, when we talk about persuasion, there's a couple of different aspects of it I wanted to go over with you, some nice fancy Greek words. The first is ethos. And ethos is just your personal credibility. So we go back a few slides here talking about what determines your credibility with an audience. The pathos is the emotional appeal. And that's an important part when you're presenting to a group of people. You want to connect with them on an emotional level. You want to engage them on that as well. So finding out what's important to them, what they're passionate about, so you can show them that you're passionate about those same things. And the last one that we tend to spend most of our time on is the logos, which is the logic, the evidence, the deduction. Now, certainly that's very important, but to be persuasive in your career, your personal life, you really have to, it's a three-legged stool that you need to be working from. So all three of those aspects are important. So evidence, facts and statistics, just make sure you got them right. And that's why I emphasize so much in all of my classes, why it's so important that you know statistics and understand how to correctly utilize data. You do not want to make a mistake and to mislead people with data, and you certainly don't want to do it intentionally. You need to provide examples when you're persuading someone about it, and you're talking about something, to be able to go into in the middle of your presentation and say, for example, let me share with you something that I believe illustrates this point very clearly. And then testimony. Do you have some people, whether it's yourself or others, that have recognized authority that can state an opinion on this that you can draw into it. So when you pull all of those in, then you have a very persuasive presentation. Now, one of the things to remember about, and I have to remind myself this all the time in my face-to-face classes, is that students and your audience will tune out very quickly. So as this chart shows, the minute you start talking, the attention starts dropping. And so on an average presentation, you really bottom out in the middle here, and you finally come back up a little bit at the end. But all the stuff in the middle is wasted. So what you want to do, the reality is you're going to start to lose your audience. And so then can you bring them back up with an intermediate conclusion, a startling statement, a puzzling result, something to draw them back into what you're saying. And so you do that a couple of times to pull them back up a little bit. Then when you get to the final conclusions, you don't have as far to pull them back up, so you can have a pretty good ending. So a couple of points on it. Don't put your final conclusion somewhere in the middle. Keep them till the end. As I mentioned earlier, some of the techniques that you want to do to hold interest in the middle. Another thing you can do periodically, especially if you've got a long presentation, is to say, okay, let's everybody stand up, stretch, take a 5-minute bathroom break, whatever. You get some physical movement, you break things up a little bit. You do want to include some conclusions along the way. You don't want to hold and save everything to the final end. You give them some nuggets along the way to keep them engaged with you. Just don't get to your final conclusions prematurely. Your message needs to be organized. The best way to organize your message is start with an outline. I'm always amazed at how many people start writing a report or creating a PowerPoint without first creating an outline. It's essential. That's the only way you're going to have something that flows logically that will keep your audience engaged. So some of the things there, you need to capture your key points. What are key questions? Write down the alternatives that you want to compare, as you're developing your outline. Stories are great. That's why I mentioned earlier, getting your audience's attention back when you can tell a story. I remember a time when we experienced a very similar situation over at previous company I worked for, and this is what we found. This was the experience. People like listening to stories. This still works. A little simple thing I'm going to show you. Some things just always work. You start out at the beginning with your introduction. You tell them what you're going to tell them. This is what we're going to be talking about in the next few minutes. Then you do it. Keep your word. Tell them what you said you were going to tell them. When you get to the end, you remind them of what you told them. Very effective way of organizing any presentation. For that matter, any written communications you do too. You're always going to start with an introduction, you're going to have the body, and then you're going to have the closing. Capturing attention. These are, we could talk about each one of these for a long time. These all work. Eye contact is very important. As you're talking to an audience, you need to be looking around the room, making eye contact with people. The box there says movement. You want to be free to walk around in the venue that you're presenting so that you're not just a static figure. Use your hands. If you have samples, those are great. Just make sure you've got enough samples that you can pass around so they can get around very quickly so you don't spend a lot of time waiting for everyone to get a chance to see the sample. Gimmicks, I'm not so much into gimmicks. Sometimes they can work. It depends on the particular topic. Questions are great, but make sure they're sincere questions. Like I said before, you don't want to have a rhetorical question. That's meaningless. It needs to be a sincere question. Get to a point saying, well, we can go two ways right now. I can spend more time talking on this first part, or we can go off on this sidebar discussion over here. And so with a quick show of hands, how many of you are interested in the sidebar? Oh, I see that. Well, actually, it looks like the majority would like to do the sidebar. Okay, so let's go that way. It needs to be a legitimate question that you're asking people. Demos are great if you have a product that can do that too. These are all, like I say, we could spend a lot of time talking on how to take advantage of these. Drama, like I say, that'd be a whole another discussion. The one thing you don't see up there, although you might say it could fall under gimmicks, is comedy. Now, I like to include some comedy sometimes, but it is really, really, really dangerous. You have to know your audience very well. What you think is funny might be very insulting to some key people. So I caution you, don't use comedy very often. And like I say, unless you know that group very, very well. We've kind of talked about this, analogies, personal anecdotes, nonverbal messages. Oh, I like this. Look professional. Now, the key here is, can any of you, I'd love to see a show of hands, but we can't do that in online class here. But could you define for me what it means to look professional? And I can sum it up in one word. Depends. It really depends on who your audience is. So now let me give you an example. I'm going to tell you a story. So I was working for General Electric Medical Systems, and our normal business attire was a shirt, tie, sport coat, slacks. So not quite a three-piece business suit, but pretty nice. So I went over to the main hospital in Boise, Idaho to do some work. And I showed up there, and the head of the cardiology department took one look at me and said, "Did you come here to do any work?" He was standing there in blue jeans and cowboy boots. The professional attire for that organization in that environment was very casual compared to how I came dressed. So I didn't look professional. I looked out of place. So you need to understand with your audience, what is a professional look? Now, on the other hand, when I went to Japan, I was wearing three-piece suits. White shirts, no colored shirts, very, rigid kind of thing there. So you just have to know your audience. The other one there, get out from the podium. That's why I said before, you need to be able to walk around, engage with your audience. Don't let anything physical be between you and your audience. So you don't want a podium. You don't want anything. You want to be, just like you're having a conversation. There's videos that we could watch. We're not going to do it for sake of time on this, on body language, things to do with your hands, how to leverage that. And then I just wanted to cover, since PowerPoint is what's used a lot, let's go over just a few brief points on best practices. So PowerPoint's economical. Everybody knows it. Most businesses utilize Microsoft Office. It's there. You can make last minute changes. You can print out notes, and there's a lot of things it does well. You can even do some very complex animation. So it's a pretty good tool. But any tool can be misused. I like this quote: "A mindless gaggle of bullet-pointed morons." when you look at some of the PowerPoint presentations that people make, it certainly kind of fits into that. So it's something that can be abused a lot. You know, what tends to happen is people get a meeting notice and what they're thinking in the back of their minds is great. I'm going to waste a bunch of time. I'm going to be bored by the presentation yet again. You don't want to be that person. You want to be the kind of person that people looking forward to actually going to their presentation. So here's some quick 10 tips for those presentations. Write a script. Well, that's kind of like, the outline. You start with the outline, then write your script so you can know exactly what it is you want to say. Most presentations aren't, as I said earlier. Most people dive right in and then you have problems. We already talked about the beginning, middle, and end. That introduction, body, conclusion. And then this is a big one for me. One thing at a time. Now you'll notice as I've been talking about these points, I bring up one item at a time, not the whole slide, not the whole screen. It's very easy to do in PowerPoint. If you don't know how to do it, you need to find out. Because it helps you keep your audience in sync with you. If you show them a whole slide, half of the audience is going to be on the first bullet point, half's going to be on the last one, and some of them are going to be in the middle, and you won't have a good rapport with your audience. So bring the content, the topics in one idea at a time. No paragraphs. In fact, I would say most of the time you're not writing incomplete sentences. The point of the PowerPoint slide is to really just remind you of what the topic is that you wanted to talk about. You're going to talk in complete sentences. You may even talk in complete paragraphs on a point, but you don't put that up on the slide. That's in your script that you wrote at the beginning, not in what you display on the screen. Pay attention to design. You don't want to have a really ugly looking PowerPoint slide. Now you'll notice the slides that I've been doing, notice that that's a very light background with dark characters. That's intentional. Studies have shown that it's easier for people to read dark characters on light backgrounds. So generally speaking, do not use any of the PowerPoint templates you can get online and so forth that have dark backgrounds unless there's a specific reason why your presentation should use that. PowerPoint has a lot of, effects built into it. Be careful. They're like salt. A little bit goes a long way. You want to have your presentation be simple, focused. Don't use fonts that are hard to read. That's not the purpose of it. You want something that's easy for everyone to see and read from the back of the room. So for that reason, I say you want to use any of the sans serif fonts. That's Arial, Helvetica, Calibri. That's what you want to use for presentations. Already talked about this. That's harder to read than that. See the difference? So don't use this with the dark background unless there's a specific reason you have to, and if you do that, I recommend that you increase the font size. Align your text either left or right depending on what you're doing, but don't do centered text, except for you can do some headings or titles at the top of the slide, but centered text is hard to read when you've got a bunch of bullet points that are centered because the bullet points aren't lining up and you don't know, well, is that a sub bullet, because you don't have the structure there. Avoid clutter. What I mean by there is all this white space around the slide. This is good. Don't put a lot of unnecessary stuff there. Now, having said that though, a few images to add some color to the slide, that's fine if it makes sense, but don't go crazy. PowerPoint's built-in clip art. It's pretty rudimentary and people have all seen it, so if you're going to use images, go find some nice images. Just make sure you understand what the copyright is on those images and if you're free to use them or not. Mentioned earlier, the presentation body language is important. Things like posture, your can't talk, your attire, how you walk around the room. You don't want to be fixed behind that podium. If you can, with your presentation, if there's something shocking or something really puzzling that you can use to open up your presentation, that the idea here is that you want to engage your audience. A startling statement that everybody goes, what? And like I say, not all presentations you can find that, but if you can, it works well. I already talked about asking questions, modulate. What's meant here is that you want to have your voice, get louder, softer, slower, faster, change the general demeanor of how you're speaking, just like you would if you're having a conversation. In fact, that's what I stress, is that your presentation should be like you're having a conversation with your audience. Sometimes when people are presenting, they have a tendency to fall into a monotone voice that's very rhythmic, constant, and it's boring. You don't want to be that way. You want to have those inflections. You want to have those pauses, those intentional pauses where you put a pause in to let people think about something. And the only way you get there is this practice, practice, practice. That's the only way you can do an effective presentation. You have to practice it multiple times. If you're not comfortable as a public speaker, consider joining a group like Toastmasters. The last one, I like what the author said on this. Don't be afraid to break the rules. So we just talked about 9 rules, but it's okay to break them because you can't come up with a rule that fits every possible situation. There's always going to be an exception. That's okay. As long as you make it intentionally, you're choosing to break it and you have a good reason why, it's okay. But if you're breaking rules just because you're ignoring them or you don't know any better, then that's going to lead to a shoddy, boring presentation. Now, I added these last ones are my own, so I'm saying it's actually 14 tips. Spelling and grammar, we've already talked about that. Spell check in Word is better than the spell check in PowerPoint. So you might want to spell check in Word first and then copy your text into PowerPoint. But even Word doesn't catch everything. So have someone who isn't familiar with your presentation take a look at it. You'd be surprised. They'll find things that you missed that once they point it out to you, you're going, how on earth did I miss that? You don't want to look foolish. Okay, time to tell a story about me. Major presentation in front of all of senior management. And I get up there and my first slide I put up has November 31st. And of course, there is no November 31st. The CEO is at the back of the room and he yells out in a loud voice, there is no November 31st. How do you think the rest of my presentation went? Not as good as I had hoped. So you don't want to do that. Trust me, I've been there. Be consistent. And what I mean by be consistent is stay with the same font size, the same bullets. Unless you want to change it up again for a specific reason, that's okay. The default for PowerPoint is to make the font smaller to fit all the text onto a single slide. You need to turn that off whenever you're creating a presentation. If you have too much text, let it flow off the bottom of the slide, because then that tells you you've got too much text on that slide. Don't allow it to auto size the text for you. The last one really is watch your time. In all the business situations I've been in, you will be allocated a time slot. That's a rigid time slot. You do not want to go over that. On the flip side, you don't want to have it too short either. If you don't use up all the time you were allocated, it makes it look like you didn't take it seriously or you weren't prepared. So you do have to be as close to right on the time that they allotted you as possible. If there's a lot of interest, what will happen is they'll talk and they'll say, I think we could delay the next presentation for a few minutes. Why don't you go back and tell us some more about this? So if they're really engaged with you, they'll give you permission to exceed the time, but you need to assume that you have a hard stop on the time. Okay, the password for this week's quiz, gee, no surprise there, is PowerPoint. And remember, it's case sensitive. Now, a couple of parting thoughts is when you're looking at making a great presentation, there's a couple that I'll point you to as an example. One is the Gettysburg Address by President Lincoln. He started out, he had some key thoughts. They met on a battlefield. They were going to dedicate a portion of the field. There was unfinished work to do in the country. And then he reviewed some of the key factors, what makes this country unique. It was conceived in liberty. Men are equal. There's a shared vision. Government of, for, and by the people. It's a new nation. Civil War. Dedicate field. Dedicated unfinished work. And when you look at that, it's an extremely powerful message that he presented on that, because it was well thought out and he communicated it very, very well. It's too bad that we don't have a recording to hear how he actually delivered it. All we have is the written transcript. To hear someone and see someone really do an excellent job, go onto YouTube and search for the iPhone launch that was presented by Steve Jobs at Macworld. He does just a superb job of building excitement into that room and communicating the message. It's just excellent. So take some time sometime when you get a chance and watch it. I think you'll really enjoy it. So how do you present like Steve Jobs? And this is got this information from Carmen Gallo at Business Week. You set the theme, you demonstrate enthusiasm. If you want people to be enthusiastic, you have to be enthusiastic. Again, you have an outline. Make the numbers meaningful. If you talk about, $1 trillion, do any of you have any concept what $1 trillion is? Translate it into something like, well, that would be equivalent to selling, at a Starbucks store, if you were going to sell a latte, one every minute, it would take you, 1,900 years to sell $1 trillion worth of lattes. Now, I didn't work out the numbers ahead of time. That may be totally wrong what I just said, but you get what I'm, trying to illustrate. You translate it into something that we can understand. And you say, wow, that's a lot. If you can get those unforgettable moments, watch this, watch the Steve Jobs when he announces the iPhone. That unforgettable moment when he puts it all together and you see for the first time, remember, nobody, a smartphone did not exist until the iPhone. And so the whole audience is all of a sudden, they're getting it. Oh my gosh, this is something totally new. I bet you everyone that was in that, that auditorium that day still remembers that moment. Visual slides, give them a show. This is one thing that I like. You are a performer. maybe if you're not comfortable doing that, maybe you should take some drama classes, learn how to be a performer. That could be too. But you want to provide, you want to have people walking out saying, wow, that was really worth my time. Don't worry about the small problems. Sometimes people get tripped up because they state something wrong, or they forgot to mention this point. Don't worry about it. The people in the audience are going after the big nuggets. So if you had a little, glitch along the way, don't emphasize it. Remember that in your presentation, you should always be focusing on the benefit, what you're proposing. You're proposing a particular line of products, some actions that need to be taken. Emphasize the benefit to the organization, to the group. What are they going to get for that? And again, we get back to this practice, practice, practice. It's rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. You need to know your presentation down pat. You know it exactly. Now, that's an interesting expression. I'll have to look that up. What does down pat mean? Anyhow, I digress. You need to know it so well. That's the only way you can be effective. So there we have it. That's week 7 communication. You should be making excellent progress on your report by now. If you have any questions on your paper, be sure and send me an email.